Welcome, digital media students, either on the internet or in the wonderful classrooms of Brooks Composite High School. My name is Mr. David Brown, and in this lesson, we're going to be creating high polygon models from low polygon models. This is part of our intermediate 3D modeling program. We're going to be diving back into the wonderful world of Blender. In lesson 1 of the intermediate 3D modeling program, we follow a tutorial from Russell Midfield, and there will be links provided in the description below, or I will be putting in a card as we're just getting started on this YouTube adventure. But they created a bear, and through that tutorial, this bear is wonderful, but it needs something more to interact with. So what does every bear want to interact with? Well, why not a honeypot? So this is a great way to practice our low poly techniques using subdivision modeling from our previous learning and then adding something on top of it. Let's get started. To get started with this wonderful piece, we're going into general mode of Blender. By clicking general mode, I'm greeted by the default cube, of which I'm going to promptly delete. Hitting X on my keyboard, I can now just delete it, or I can bring it back using Control Z for undo, and then hit the delete key on my keyboard. What we're using today for a reference is the honeypot in this wonderful section of the screen, and I'm using a program called PureRef to bring it out. It's just as wonderful, powerful, and flexible, and just as free, and you can choose to donate. I would highly recommend donating to the wonderful folks at PureRef. I really like it because now it's not in my program, it's on top of it, so I have a little more flexibility in what goes into my model here. Now, when we did the sculpt, you brought in the reference images and pulled your shapes around them. I want to avoid that because we need to use references just to get ideas of forms. So what kind of form do we see in a honeypot? Well, we see cylinders. So I'm going to go into front orthographic view. Again, that's just a personal preference. You don't have to. But Shift A on our keyboard and selecting a cylinder from the mesh menu. You could also use the add option up here in the wonderful buttoned menu, but I just like to use the keyboard shortcuts. We're going to tab into edit mode. Again, you could use the drop down. What we're going to do is create some loop cuts. Now you could use the loop cut button over here, or I like to use Control R, and scrolling up on my mouse wheel, I can create some more cuts. One of the things you need to make note of as we create these cuts is I want a central loop here because I want to create a shape that looks like a barrel. Why? Well, the honeypot kind of looks like a barrel. So I'm going to left click to start the loop cut. I can then move it, but I don't need to, so I'm just going to hit escape and our cut is created. I'm going to alt left click to get this vertex loop or edge loop in the middle, and now I'm going to scale it out. In order to scale it out, I hit S on my keyboard and then I can pull, but you'll notice I'm not getting all of the points. It's not starting to create that barrel shape. I need to turn on proportional editing. So hitting escape so I don't actually make that scale, I'm going to turn on proportional editing either by clicking the button at the top, or I can hit O in my keyboard. So now scaling out, I'm greeted with a fall off circle. I can zoom it in by scrolling my mouse wheel up, or I can zoom it out by scrolling my mouse wheel down. Pulling the shape out with the wonderful fall off circle a little bit bigger because I want to create that kind of bowed shape. Bring it in a little bit more. That looks okay. Let's go with that. And left click. Now we've got that kind of bowed shape of the honeypot. We need to make sure that we bring in the bottom because the honeypot doesn't really look like a barrel. It looks like a honeypot. So again, left click. We're going to scale this in. So sorry about that. That was alt left click. We're going to scale it. I'm going to leave proportional editing on so we get that nice tapered look. And I'm going to bring it in. Oh, that looks really good. This is better than my practice one so far. So let's keep this truck running. All right. Alt left click on the top. Let's bring this in a little bit. Again, creating a little bit of taper, not as much. We don't want to bring it in as much because the bottom on our reference is a little bit bigger than the top. Does it look exactly like the honeypot in the picture? No. Does it look like a honeypot my bear will use? Yes. It looks like a honeypot. A reference is there as a guide. It is not the be all and end all. So when you're creating shapes from reference, if you're just a little bit off, it doesn't look exactly like it, that's okay. You're the modeler. It's your shape. It shouldn't matter what the reference is doing. It's there as a guide. All right, we need to create something that resembles a lid. Now, if we think about a honey pot or any kind of like I'm looking at a coffee cup too, same type of thing, is it has this little inner lip. And what we're going to do to create that inner lip, I'm going to go to face select mode by hitting 3, or you can click on this button at the top, and I'm going to inset a face by hitting I on my keyboard. Once I hit I can push in, and now I've got this nice little inset. So there's the rim of the honey pot. Now we can also sync it down. I'm going to turn off proportional editing mode. So hitting O on my keyboard, I'm going to go G to move, Z to pull it up and down, and I'm going to push it in. Now you can kind of see the rim starts to disappear a little bit. So I'm going to inset once more. And now I'm going to push it in. Notice I made a big rim here. It doesn't matter what the size is. Now I can push it in, and you can kind of see that rim stays now and the honey sinks in. I really like that. Now that kind of looks like a cauldron or a pot. Every cauldron or a pot, though, needs a lid. In order to create this lid, we're going to duplicate this circle. So just going Shift D on your keyboard, I'm going to then press Z on my keyboard to raise it up on the Z axis because I want it to be above the honey pot so I can work with it on outside of the honey pot. I don't want them to interact. So what can I do now? Well, the honey pot lid right now is just covering the middle. I mean, as we can see here, the honey pot here kind of goes out to that area. So let's now scale it up. So hitting S on my keyboard, and we're going to pull it out. And I think that looks pretty good. And we'll go down, take a look. That looks not bad. It might be a little big. We can scale it a little bit more afterwards. Now, the problem is that we've got a circle. And I need to kind of cut this circle up. Well, in order to cut this circle up, you can delete the face in the middle. But what I'm going to do, let's inset a face again. So I'm going to hit I to inset. And now let's start to create the edges or the loops here of our lid. And I'm going to do it one more time. And now we've got something that we can bevel with. We've got something to work with to create that little edge of our honey pot. And I'm going to do it one more time. Let's go in. And you can kind of see what I'm doing is building the circles of the upper lid. And I'm going to do it again. Let's push it in. And that looks pretty good. I really like this. I like the geometry. We've got those quads going on. If we talk about quads, n-gons, and all those things, wonderful technical modeling stuff in our beginner stuff. So hopefully you have an idea if you're watching those videos what quads and n-gons and stuff are. If you don't, please post in the comments and I can easily answer. But other than that, or if you're in the classroom, just raise your hand and I'll come to you. For this scenario, we want to create as many kind of these rectangular shapes as we can. Now, this is an n-gon. Why? Because it's got a whole bunch of sides, and I don't want that. But I don't really want to push in the faces anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to hit X on my keyboard, and I'm going to only get rid of the faces. Get rid of the faces. We want to try to keep everything else. Now, there's two things you can do here. One, we need a top of our lid here. We need this little handle. You could create a sphere and fill the hole with it. I think that's a really smart option. But what I'd like to show you here is the opportunity to grid fill. So I'm going to hit 2 to go into edge select. I'm going to Alt and get this entire edge loop here. And then from this edge loop, I can go up to the face menu and click on face and then grid fill. And now this fills it with a grid of tris and quads. So we've got 3-sided shapes and 4-sided shapes, which is exactly what we want. So this is looking pretty good. It also looks like the bottom of a sphere. So that's where I kind of mentioned you could just use a sphere if you want. Now into vertex mode by hitting 1 on my keyboard or clicking the vertex button at the top, I can select the middle wonderful vertex and pull up. Now the one thing I forgot to do, and I did it on purpose, what should I have selected? And everyone resoundingly is saying into their headsets, even though I can't hear them, but you're saying it anyway, is I needed to turn on proportional editing. So let's turn on proportional editing, moving up. And now I can zoom it in a little bit because we don't want a perfect dome. That looks really good. I'm actually really happy with this right now as well. So now we've got this piece, right? Except it kind of, it's flat. It kind of looks like a symbol rather than a lid. So let's create a little bit of a shape to it. I'm going to go into 2 for my edge select mode. I'm going to grab this edge loop here, and I'm going to extrude down. So hitting E on my keyboard, and then Z to make sure I lock on the up and down axis, and I'm going to pull it down a little bit. And that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. Now, what we're going to do here is I'm going to hit fill, and you're going to scream, ah, and gone, and it's okay, because realistically, it's not a big deal. We're not animating on this, so realistically, it's fine. And the other thing too is I'm going to inset it. So I'm going to hit I, push it in, I again, we're going to push it in one more time, just like we did. And I'm going to, turn off proportional editing, GZ. So G to move, Z to move up and down, and I'm going to push it in just like we did with our honeypot. Make sure that we didn't break our geometry up on the top. This lid is looking pretty darn sweet, kind of like the honey. All right, going into vertex mode, we can see, does everything look good? I think everything looks pretty fantastic. It's a little blocky. Low poly models are typically a little blocky, but they don't have to be super blocky. So how can we get rid of some of this blockiness? Well, I can select this loop and then a control B for a bevel, and I can pull a bevel in. Now I can scroll up to create a smoother bevel or down, depending on what you're going for. So moving up, I'm going to have about 3 sections, and I'm going to round the top of this lid. Why? Because that's kind of the way my reference looks. And I'm going to do the same thing to the bottom edge as well. So I'm going to do a control B here to bevel, and we're going to pull. And we don't want to crash into our other bevels, so we have to be careful here. That looks really good. A nice rounded edge. It's a little thicker than this one, but again, this is my model. I don't really care. Last thing we're going to do, and we're going to stay in edit mode. This is kind of interesting because we're building all of this in one mesh. So your preference, you could do this in different objects, and we're going to pull some of these objects out. But for this scenario, let's add an UV sphere. And I'm going to bring it up. This is going to be the handle, and that is a really big handle. So let's scale it down. S on our keyboards, push it down. G to move, Z to go up. And I'm going to scale it one more time. So let's make sure we scale S, scale it down, and G, bring it down. I can crash it in a little bit at the top, so it looks fine. The nice thing with the grid is you can kind of get a good idea. Is it centered? And am I taking up too much space? I think it's still a little too big. Let's bring it down. And we'll bring it down Z, crash it in a little bit. That looks fine. I think that's going to be okay. Now, the other thing too is it's a little flattened. So let's flatten it. I'm going to, 1, make sure we're in vertex mode. I was already there, but I always like to make sure 1, and turn on proportional, hitting O. So we selected the top. I hit O, S to scale. Or do we want to G to move? G to move, my apologies. Now, our fall off, we can't even see it. So we have to zoom in, scroll with your mouse wheel, zoom, 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 zoom. I'm gonna bring it out a little bit. Yeah, bring it out just a little bit more. And notice as I'm pushing, I'm kind of zooming it out there. Look at that. I think that looks fantastic. We've got a fantastic start to our wonderful low poly model. Now, we don't want to keep everything the same. And the reason for that is because maybe there's some different materials we're going to assign. Obviously, we might want to shade things a little bit differently depending on how we're going to, what we're going to do with this honeypot. So if I want to separate this out, I can hit L on my keyboard to select linked objects. So L to select linked objects. And is this linked? Yep. There's no other edges touching it. That's fine. And then we can hit L on our keyboard with the sphere to now grow that selection and bring in the sphere or the handle. We're going to break this out now because I want my lid to be separate. Why? Well, maybe we might animate it at some point in time. If we want to animate the lid separately from the honeypot, we want to make sure it's a different object. So how do I get this away from our original cylinder? I hit P on my keyboard, and then I'm going to click separate by selection. Now, this is its own piece. One of the neat features about Blender 3 is that you get the ability to kind of swap between your selections a lot faster. So I can just click these little buttons here, and now I can move in edit mode between the two objects that I have. I can do the same in object mode, except there's no point because I'm just clicking. But in edit mode, it is very powerful and nice. You can also do the same thing in sculpting mode. I really like this little piece. If everyone's watching and you're going, well, that was added in like 2.7 here, Mr. Brown, like, what are you talking about? Then I just completely missed it, but I really like it. I found it and it's wonderful because now I can go back and forth between the things that I'm working with, in my opinion, a little bit quicker. One thing I don't do a whole lot, and I should start doing, is renaming our meshes to what they are supposed to be. So that's the lid, and that's the honey pot. So what are we going to do now? Well, we need to kind of start to create some more details, don't we? I'm going to move this lid down, so just hitting A on our edit mode. I'm going to put this lid back. I'm going to get rid of proportional. G on my keyboard to move. Z to scroll down. If my fingers are moving too quickly, either slow down the video or make sure you ask some questions in the comments or in the wonderful classrooms. So bring this down, G on the keyboard, Z, pulling it down, and voila, we have a lid. So back into object mode, let's take a look. That looks pretty good. I might even want to scale this knob up a little bit based on my reference, but for now, I think it looks okay. It's kind of looking like a sugar bowl lid. That's okay. We'll get there. We've got a little bit of a low poly model happening, except the one detail that I would highly encourage you to add as a separate object is the spilling honey, and that's just a really nice detail. You see it on all Winnie the Pooh honey pots, and it's a nice thing to add because it's a great feature of a high poly model. You could do it fully high poly if you so choose, but it would be tough to shape in, and it also becomes a little bit tougher to material later because we're not going to start using some complex painting programs yet. But for basic texturing, what we want to be able to do is make it yellow and then add some shading to it if we want to get that stylized look, depending on what we're going for. So let's add in a sphere that we can use to start to shape this out. So I'm going to block it out a little bit, and that's a really important thing to do. So UV sphere, and I'm going to now take it into edit mode by hitting tab, and let's scale it down, and we need to bring it out. So I want to put it on the front of the honey pot. So I'm going to hit 1, and I'm going to use my middle mouse button to pan around a little bit. G on my keyboard, Y to pull it to the front. And now I have what will start my honey drip. So I can start to pull it in. I'm going to hit 1 on my keyboard. So let's move it to its position up there, because that's where it shows up in my reference. Pivoting around, dragging it into place. And so I'm going to scale a little bit. What we're going to do now is I can duplicate this mesh, or I can add more spheres depending on which way you want. I'm going to just duplicate. So hitting L to get the link, Shift D for duplicate, and I'm going to block out this honey drip. So these are nice little blobs of honey I can start adding. So I can kind of get a little bit of the shape that I'm looking for. And all I'm doing is Shift D while I have these selected. And there we go. It kind of looks like the blobs here. We might want to add a little bit more over here, but what we can do is we can use our kind of low poly setting and work with it in sculpting mode, because I want to push this around a little bit. I want to make it look a little more organic. So let's push this around a little bit in sculpt mode in order to get the dripping honey that we're looking for. So let's get that going into sculpt mode while we have our sphere selected, and notice again, I can go to the pot, but oh man, this dot, so good, folks. Okay, G on my keyboard, F to scale my brush up, and my apologies, you can't see screencast keys, that's okay. And then let's drag it into place. So you can kind of see it's easier to move when there are less points. And this just takes a little bit of time. So you're going to drag this into place and click around. I'm not going to give you a really nice overview. You should make this look prettier than what I'm doing, because this is all the technique that you learned for the sculpting video. So we need a little bit of a kind of bigger drip there. Going to push this in. Let's shape that drip out. Let's shape this drip. Pull it out a little bit. Get it under the lid. Wonderful running commentary as we go. Now, one of the things you want to focus on is making sure that you push it under the lid. And you'll notice, you might even hear, I use a mouse for this. The main reason is because not everyone has access to a drawing tablet or a drawing monitor. And for that reason, I want to show that you can do all of this with a mouse. I've noticed a lot of my young sculptors are getting very good at using a mouse. The problem is you don't get a lot of the pressure sensitivities that are offered by a drawing tablet or monitor. So that is the reason why you want to use it, is because you can make a lot more finer movements. You'll notice I keep clicking because everything is set by very strong strength when I'm using my grab tool. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're working. If you have access to it, I highly recommend using it, but you don't have to. It's not something you have to do, right? Just like you don't have to follow the reference image. I'm going to push this one up. And it's a little bit broken, but I'm okay. I'm okay with that because we're going to remesh it anyway. And for those that remember their sculpting training, remeshing means that I'm going to change the voxel size of this shape. That looks okay. You know what? It kind of matches the reference. And again, I'm going to play with it more as we sculpt out the details. So as we sculpt the details, we'll definitely create a much cleaner set of honey. So going into my orthographic front, I have a little bit of a honey drip. Now, does it match exactly? No, it doesn't. Does my lid match exactly? No, it doesn't. But does it look like a honey pot? Yes, it does. It has the semblance of the forms of the honey pot. So this is the low poly section. So if you decided to skip ahead because you're like, hey, I know how to do all this stuff, well, welcome to the high poly section. Now that we have the form of a honey pot, what we can do is going back into our layout mode. We've got our honey set up. We've got everything blocked out in wonderful low poly land. There are two ways of doing this. Yep. Of course, in Blender, there's more than one way to do things, but there are two ways of doing this. So this is now going to split the video again into using the duplication method and creating details on a remeshed object, or you can use the multi-resolution modifier. So there'll be one chapter for duplication or one chapter for multi-resolution. I would recommend multi-resolution. It's a little bit easier to generate the normal map. And we'll talk more about that when we get to that part of the video. But what we're going to do is show both. The reason is because if you're looking at tutorials, if you're like, I don't really understand what Brown's doing here, those are both of the ways that you will find. So I just try and squish it all into one super long, awesome sauce video. So first, I'm going to start with the multi-resolution method. So multi-resolution method means we're going to use the multi-resolution modifier. Multi-resolution modifier can be applied just by going into making sure we've got our pot selected. I'm going to just hide the honey for now because I want to make sure I just see the pot. And this is interesting because now we can work with the pot and the lid separately. And that means I'm going to show you how to do it on one, and you're going to be challenged to now apply it to the other. The reason being is the honey pot itself may have different details than the lid. If we want the details to be the same, we can just rejoin our shapes and go from there with the modifier. And we can separate it afterwards if we so choose. How do we add this modifier? I'm going to work with the pot. I would then give you the lid because the lid is honestly more interesting because there's a lot more detail. But the honey pot, what we can do is go to our modifier menu. It is the blue wrench on the right-hand side and add modifier. By clicking on the drop-down, you can see we're going to select from one of these wonderful modifiers, and I'm glad it's not covered by my reference, is multi-resolution. Under the generate section, we're going to click on multi-resolution. Multi-resolution is absolutely wonderful. You find it in a lot more of the other sculpting programs. I really have started to grow a preference for it. It's something I think is very interesting because it allows you to create levels of detail on different views so you can get a really good sense for the model as a whole. And it's only with one click. The multi-resolution modifier is interesting because it's one piece, right? I can just keep working with what I'm working on. I get both high poly and low poly in one space. How do I create more high poly though? You can see it still looks very blocky. Well, I need to subdivide. We've always done this. I could do that through loop cuts and start to model it around it, or with multi-resolution, I can just click subdivide, and you can now see it starts to shape a little bit. Subdivision level 1, still blocky. Let's go lower. Subdivision level 2, still blocky. Let's go lower. Subdivision level 3, now this is kind of your basic sculpting start. And you can see we're seeing some pinching down here. And the reason is I didn't put a grid fill mesh under here. That's fine. We won't worry about it because no one's really going to look at the bottom anyway. And then we can go subdivide again. Let's make it nice and tight. So this one, we've got some really nice detail here we can start to add. Subdivision level 5 is where you get some really nice detail on your sculpt. It's still a little bit blocky. 6 is better, but some computers will start to really lag at this point. Now, what you can notice with multi-resolution, I have 3 options. I have viewport, sculpt, and render. Now, I can turn my viewport down. So there's 4, there's 3, there's 2, there's 1, and there's none. And you can see I can move between all of my subdivision levels. Now, I like to put my viewport either at 1 or 2. 2 is not bad because you still can kind of see the details. They look a little blocky, but that's okay. But what's really interesting is the sculpting component. And this is where I got blown away when I started watching videos for other programs. And they use multi-resolution a lot more often. And I can kind of understand why, because it's the one-stop shop. So when I go into sculpt mode, I am in subdivision level 5. So if I click the modifier for our honeypot, sculpt mode is in subdivision level 5. So what I can do, I get that nice, really high detailed sculpt. And I'm going to get rid of that because that's not what a honeypot looks like in any way, shape, or form. But if I want to do some bigger movements, say I want to push in a piece of the honeypot, say I want some blocky drawings or pieces in here, maybe I'm creating some chips of clay coming off and then leaving them there, I can also reduce my sculpting level. So down to 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Now, why is that important? Because with less vertices, it's easier to do movements. So now with this big motion, I'm going to affect a whole bunch of vertices, and you can see I can pull and move the object a little bit easier. How do I know that? Because if I go up to subdivision 4 and do kind of the same thing, I barely notice it. Why? Because I'm pulling a lot of points and it shapes those points. You'll notice as you pivot around, you do lose a little bit of that definition, and it's because it goes to the level viewport. That's okay because it snaps back. It's a little bit weird. It's kind of something unsettling. You got to get used to it, but that's okay. So I'm going to bring that back out. I'm going to go back to my front orthographic view, and I'm going to bring it up to a level 5, my highest subdivision level, because I'm going to start creating some shapes. Now, if we take a look at the reference, we could create some of those gouges for the labels, maybe for a little bit of a ring that goes around the honeypot. I think that would look a little bit nice. But what we're going to show is maybe a little bit of weathering on the honeypot. We're going to create some kind of clay that's been pitted a little bit. We're also going to add in just some cracks, maybe some nice designs as an older honeypot. Maybe it's some ancient, cool Winnie the Pooh honeypot with flowers that are etched into it. It doesn't matter because it's my honeypot. So how do I do that? Well, welcome to just sculpting. I'm going to use my main tools. I use draw sharp, and clay strips more often than not. Blob and place are really, or blob and inflate are fine. And I'm also going to use the crease tool quite a bit to create those little bit of crevices. One thing I do recommend is if you want to take this pot to a completely new level, find some brushes. So go out there on the wonderful world of the internet and see if you can find some brushes for some cracks or crevices or things like that. I don't cover it because it's so much easier just to work with the base pack, and my students typically just work with the base pack, but I highly recommend taking a look for some brushes. So let's start creating some of this wonderful stuff. Again, using the mouse, I'm just going to create some creases. So we're going to push that in a little bit. And now we're just creating that kind of weathered effect as if this has happened. I think that might be too big. I'm going to back this truck up a little bit. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller. F on my keyboard. Bring that down. Yeah, there we go. That's better. Much better. So it kind of looks like cracking a little bit. It's creating some weather marks. So something show that this is weathered. And if you're just like, this looks weird. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's my honey pot. Okay, that looks fine. I'm going to add some clay strips on the outside. Smooth those down by holding shift on my keyboard. And all I'm doing is creating that clay look. A little bit of raised edging to create the fact that a clay pot is probably not perfectly round. It's going to have some bumps. It's going to have some lumps. And all I'm doing is defining the creases that I've made in just specific locations. I'm not going to do it all. It's got some bumps. It's got some lumps. Let's just define some of these, create some bumpies. And this is the point of the video where either A, you fast forward because you're like, whatever, or just nice and quietly follow along, have your peaceful music in the background. And this is the fun part. This is the part that I really enjoy about sculpting and modeling in Blender. Is it's so relaxing. Just letting your model come together. Let your creativity just kind of take it to whatever level you want and go from there. And again, don't worry about perfection. There's no way you can create the exact same mouse movements that I'm doing. Again, do not worry about perfection. Create the model that you're looking for. Maybe you don't like the way that I'm shaping this out. I really do, by the way. I really like where this is going. Again, clay strips again. I'm just adding some bumps in here. You could also use the clay brush to do some of this work. The clay brush is a little too smooth, but you know what? Let's give it a go. I like clay strips because I like that hard edge, but I tend to work with a little more stylized pieces. You could also blob some stuff in here. A little bit of blobbies, maybe some blobbies around here. Sure, whatever. Doesn't matter. What your honey pot, right? Okay. I think that's enough. That's good. There's a lot more I could do here. I could add a lot more weathering. I would probably want to add maybe a layer. I can run a layer around the bottom here. Now, this one, I would either highly recommend a pen. It's something too. You need a lot of practice to do some of those things. That one is something I would likely model in rather than sculpt in. But I do know a lot of students, especially ones that really enjoy sculpting, they can draw perfect lines and make things that I definitely cannot. So especially with a mouse. I'm a lot better with a pen. Mouse is tough. Now we've got that nice weathering piece. What more can we add? Well, we can continually work on this until we get exactly what we want. Again, we can etch out kind of that honey plate. So notice I'm working on front or the graphic view because I just want to create nice, easy shapes. So again, I'm creasing out that honey pot label. And that's okay. Like I created a lot of nice weathering there. Maybe I want to leave it. Maybe if I decide to add a texture or whatever I decide to do with that honey pot label, maybe I want that. Maybe I want it to look a little bumpy, and that's okay. I'm going to smooth that out just a little bit. Let's smooth out the crease a little bit. And again, the hard thing with a mouse is that I have to kind of almost continually click. Otherwise I over smooth a little bit sometimes, but there we go. That's kind of nicely etched out. I can go into perspective and I can kind of see what's going on. Let's add that sphere back in. Now I covered up the label. So that tells me we got a lot of work to do. Now our multi-resolution modifier is only on the honey pot itself. So now I'm going to click. Again, I love this. I love this. I can just go back to here. Now notice, oh my, our honey pot doesn't look as nice. Well, that's okay because remember, it's a multi-resolution modifier. It went back to level 2 because that's what I had set up for my levels viewport. As soon as I put it back into sculpting mode, I get that beautiful high definition. So let's move this around so you can skip ahead in the video if you don't want to see me move around all of the stuff, but that's up to you. I'm going to push it around, make sure that I'm not over top of the label. I added a little bit too much on the block out, but that's okay. I can pull it around, push it around. I'm going to smooth a little bit. I'll tinker with this a little bit as fast as I can. But again, if you want to skip ahead to what we're going to be using that wonderful multi-resolution modifier for, by all means do so. Now, for those of you that stuck around, what I'm going to do now, because I'm in a place where I've done all of the big movements that I possibly can. I'm going to remesh this. So using my remesh tool, leave the voxel size quite high, Control R on my keyboard, and now I can kind of push this around a little bit. And now it works a lot more because now it's voxelized like sculpting. I'm going to leave this one alone because I kind of like that drip there. We're going to pull this back up. We're going to tuck it. I'm going to bring my brush down a little bit. We're going to pull it in here, move that out. Again, this is just the part I love about sculpting is this is the relaxing part. Okay, I'm going to remesh again, Control R on my keyboard, just to make sure I got some really nice shape going on here. And I'm going to bring this up a little bit. It's looking okay. I'm really enjoying where this is going. Again, I want to keep this separated because if I'm going to create some materials for my honey, which I should be, then I want to make sure that I can color it yellow without having to make any big edit things going on here. That looks pretty good. Now I'm going to lower my voxel size, so Shift R to create a smaller voxel and drag in or out depending on where you're going. Again, this is going to create bigger ones because I'm zooming in, making big. I want to zoom out, get a little more detail. Let's go to about 0.5, somewhere close to 0.5, 0.25, 0.0525. See if I can get it back again. 3, that's fine. Now that it's set, remember it's set, it's not going to do it. I'm going to go Control R and there we go. This is nice because I can kind of tell what subdivision level I'm on, can't I? I'm looking at almost a subdivision level 2, and I can play around with it a little bit better. So let's now refine these details. That's starting to look really nice. Okay, I went a little too smooth there. That's okay. Push it up. Now, this is the beauty of sculpting, is we just keep going until we get the shape that we want. That looks good. I'm going to leave it there. I think that's going to be nice. It's not the same, but I know what's happening here. I have a pretty good idea of what's going on here. It would be nice. Maybe I'm going to pull out another piece of honey here. Round that off. Pull it out. Let's add a remesh because you can see I'm stretching it too much. There we go. Again, a lot of fun here. Hopefully everyone is enjoying this task. I think it's going to turn out really nice. It's going to work really well with our bear. It's going to create a really nice render in the end. There we go. I think that's good. We'll leave it there. Now that we've got that all selected, again, it doesn't affect what we're going to do next a whole bunch, but it just brings the model together, doesn't it? So I'm going to go back to sculpt mode on my honeypot using that nice quick select. If you don't have it, you have to go back to object mode, select your honeypot and go back there. So we got this nice honeypot, weathered honeypot. We've got some honey coming out of the lid. And again, I've left the lid alone because that's going to be the challenge for you, either using duplication method or you can utilize multi-resolution modifier from here. So now I've got that multi-res. What do we do with it? What's the whole point of doing and utilizing all of these wonderful tools to create this detail? Because as soon, and I'll go just back to layout, I lose all of that detail, right? I can bring it back just by bringing up my multi-res here, but let's keep it down. I'm going to bring it all the way down to 1. It's like, that looks like trash. Well, that's okay, because what we're going to generate here are some normal maps. The normal maps are going to make this look a lot better. And this process is slightly different between duplicate mode and multi-resolution mode. And this is why I prefer multi-resolution, because when I'm generating my normal maps, it is so much easier. All right, let's go into our shading menu. And inside the shading menu, we need to create some stuff / materials and textures for our honeypot. So I'm going to click on a new piece here, make sure honeypot is selected. You can see we have no material assigned to it. Let's create a material, new. So this is now what's going to be covering that honeypot. And I need to create a texture. And you're probably kind of going, why? That's a little weird. Well, let's go Shift A to create a new texture. Going to the texture menu and then to image texture. You can also click on add in the buttons here within the space, but right now I have an image texture. There's not much you need to do with your image texture at this point in time. We just need it to be there. It's just going to hang out because we're going to save something to it. We're going to create that normal map and then save to it. And how do we do that? Well, we're going to use our rendering engines. And if you're not familiar with the rendering stuff, because we don't cover this a whole bunch, what you can do with your renderer is you want to select cycles. And this is also why you want Blender 3, because now you're working with the most modern version of cycles. It's really, really good. Your device, you can do what you want. I preferred GPU compute. This particular computer that I shoot my videos on has a wonderful GPU, so I use it a lot. I don't change much of the other settings right now because it doesn't really matter. So what we need to do is we want to do some baking. And no, unfortunately, we aren't going to make some cookies. We're just going to make a beautiful purple normal map. Well, how do we do that? Again, multi-resolution, much easier. We don't have to change any of this. We don't have to go in here and find normals and do all fancy stuff because you probably watched 1,000 tutorials on that if you're big into Blender, but all I'm going to do is click Bake for Multi-Res. That's it. Bake for Multi-Res. Notice everything changes, and that's okay. All right, we're baking for Multi-Res. We're going to bake the normals. You could also do a displacement map. We don't really talk about the displacement piece. That's okay. It's probably would be a little more effective. Don't worry about it. Bake for multi-res. We're going to bake our normals. Make sure your image texture is selected and then click bake. And now it says you need an active texture. Well, that means we just need to make a new texture, right? So I'm going to go new and I'm going to call this normals because we need that texture. Resolution is fine here. You could probably bump it up. It doesn't really matter. Again, if we bumped it up, we're just going to get some better detail. Not a big deal for us. So we called it normals. Do not change really anything here because it's not necessary. There is something we're going to want to change afterwards, but that's okay. Big for multi-res still selected. Normal still selected. We now have a texture to select to. Click bake and boom. Wow, right? That was easy. I like that. So now we've got this normals image. Now where did it go? What did it do? So in this scenario, we need our image to show up here. So we're going to try and make sure that we find it over here. Normals. And there it is. And notice what normals does. We got some nice detail here, don't we? We got some detail showing up. We got a lot of lines, and that just has to do with our levels that we have things set at for our modifier, and that's okay. We could probably bump up the levels to create a little bit better of a normal map here, but that's okay. We have normals. Now, this is the thing you need to make sure that you do. You need to save it. Clicking on the wonderful hamburger button or sandwich button, depending on your preference, you'll see the stars by the image. Make sure you're in the image menu and then go save, or Alt S is the key command, and save that image. Now, you could put it wherever you want. You can see I've got a whole bunch of folders going on here. I put it in a pictures folder, and in the pictures, all I'm going to do is make sure I have a new folder, and I'm just going to call it normal maps. And within that folder, you don't need to really change in these settings. You don't need the alpha channel. If you just go to RBG, that's fine. The alpha channel is nice if you want to include transparencies, and that's where things get complicated. So don't worry about that too much right now. Just make sure you've got normals and put it in a folder. It just makes things easier, and then save. So now that that image is saved, we can apply this image into our model. One of the things you need to change is the color space. Notice it's not a very dynamic color. Normal maps are always this cool violet because that's the way the program determines depth. It's what color of purple it has or magenta it has is what it does. So what you want to change your color space to is non-color. And now it's kind of the more standard purple you'll see. It's not a big deal if you leave it on here. You get pretty purple. Again, not huge. A non-color is typically what you will find. Now, we want to utilize this and plug it in here to our normals, but you can see color and normal, they're not the same thing. So I need something that is the same. Well, luckily, Blender has a normal map node that we can use. So add, or again, Shift A in your keyboard. So I was going to use hotkeys. So Shift A. You could type in the search here. So clicking on search, go normal, and don't use normal. You want normal map. So as soon as you type in normal, you get two options. You want normal map. So clicking on normal map, we can bring it down here. Now, this is why you do non-color, because the color is set down here. Take your color and drag it in here, and you'll notice the color is set there until, boom, we change it, because this is what we want. Now, this is now normal, and this is now normal. I can hook these two together. So now I can hook them together, and you should have noticed something happened. I'm going to zoom in a little bit or back up. And notice it has some detail. Let's remove that connection. Boop. It's not really there, is it? We're in kind of super low poly mode. Why? Because remember, we're at level 1 of our particular piece. So now if I attach that normal map again, boop, Does it look like we're in level 5? It sure does. Sure does. Let's put it on rendered mode so that the lighting is not quite as powerful. Now, you can really see that we really needed to do some adjusting with other things, but I really want you to see how to do it, and then we can fine tune it in later pieces. But you can clearly see taking off that normal map, right? And bringing it back, we get some detail. And now this is also too, we're in a different level of our multi-resolution modifier. Let's bump that back up and let's see if we notice any big changes. Part 2 of creating a high poly model from a low poly model. Our low poly is the base mesh for the high poly. The reason being is that as I change this, right, as I remesh this, I'm changing the actual structure of my low poly model. That means I don't have anything to apply my normal map to. And that's why multi-resolution modifier is a little bit nicer, is because you are working with the low poly model the entire time. But now I need to, again, duplicate. So I'm going to undo that remesh. I'm going to my layout mode, make sure I've got my honeypot selected, and I'm going to shift D, make sure I've got a new one, hit escape to bring it back. That's fine. And I'm going to change its name, and I'm going to call it in HP or high poly. It's also high pot. It's whatever you so choose. But in this one, it's just my high poly. Now, if you want to keep it close to your other model, again, you would use the same thing. And then I use underscore HP. I think that would work nice because now they're just side by side. Your naming convention's your naming convention. You can also put it in another collection. However you choose to organize your project. Right now, I don't focus too much on those things because those are for my advanced students that are creating portfolio items. All right, now I have a high poly mesh. What can I do with it? Now I can start working with it because I still have the low poly setup that I had before. So into our sculpting mode, we're now going to remesh this, and we're going to want to create some significant detail. So we know that when I remesh here, it's not a significant remesh. And now you'll notice it kind of looks a little busted. That's because we've got our low poly still on. Let's hide that using the visibility. And now all I'm going to do is work with the high poly. We noticed that when we did it with the low poly that it didn't work so well. So what we want to do is create a higher voxel setting just to get that detail going that we want. So Shift R, and then let's drag out to create smaller. We're zooming out. And again, 0.5 is a pretty good place. Sorry, 0.05 is a pretty good place to start. That sets what we're going to create. Now Control R remeshes, and that looks a lot nicer. We need to smooth this out though. And we could hold Shift and drag all the way around this and break the honeypot in many, many ways. One of the coolest settings, and I want to make sure that I've got that. Okay, so I need to apply my remesh again. So same setting, remesh applied. One of the things that I've noticed is as I'm learning these things, there's so many tools in sculpt mode. And one of the best ones is the mesh filter tool. By clicking on the mesh filter tool, and again, there's no hotkeys, so you have to scroll down on these tools. So if you've got just these brushes showing, using your mouse wheel, scrolling down, and you're going to find one that looks like blue bumpies on top of a sphere. So by clicking that, that's the mesh filter. If you're not sure what button is what, so I've got lots of people kind of do this, the multi-res displacement sphere, because they go, hey, that's what the button looks like. Leave your mouse over top of it. Let the wonderful tooltip pop up so you can see what you've got. I've got the mesh filter tool. Now, the filter type is where things get interesting because what I can do is left click hold and drag, and it affects the entire model. So that's really cool that I can do this with the mesh filter. It also is based on selection. So right now, because we have nothing else selected, it's going to work specifically with this. So what do I do now? Well, we want to smooth the entire thing because we can do surface smooth, sharpen. We can do a lot of different things. I want to smooth the entire model. Now we could turn the strength down, but it should be okay. All you do now is left click and hold and drag. And as you move one way or the other, you start to apply the mesh filter. Notice that I smooth the entire model. You either apply it or you get rid of it. You can go less detail to the left. Ew, that's terrifying. I'm going to undo that. Or more detail to the right. So I'm smoothing, 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 smoothing. And I'll get to a point where that honeypot starts to suck in a little bit. Bring it back, back. About there. I can probably move the lid. This is a little bit better. Now, again, a honeypot is not perfect, so I don't mind these little bumpies in it. I haven't got rid of everything. Maybe I'm going to pull a little bit. Let's get a little more detail. Notice I'm going nice and slow, not big movements. So left click, hold, and a little bit more. Drag. Smooth. That's looking pretty good. We've got some bumpies, that's okay. Back to front or the graphic view. I'm going to have to play with that lid later on this one, but that's okay because now it's starting to look a little bit more like our honeypot. All we can do here, I'm going to do Control R for a little bit more of a remesh. Let's reposition things. Now we sculpt. So at this point in time, we sculpt the same way that we did it before. I'm going to add in some gouges here. I'm going to trace out some of these honeypot lines. Again, I'm going to resize my brush because that's a lot too big. Let's kind of get in here. Add some creases up there so it kind of looks like that honey's pressing down on it. Adding some gouges. Create some details. I'm not going to add the label this time. There's some details. Clay strips. Smooth it out. Now you can adjust your voxel size because this is not as nearly as detailed as before. So let's do that. I'm going to go Shift R. Let's pull it down even further. Let's go to about 0.25. Okay, 0.240. That works for me. Control R, remesh. And once again, now I've got that detail. And you can keep doing that until you get the model that you're looking for. So again, I'm just adding that old clay style texture. It's bumpy. Kind of looks pitted. I could probably, if I spent a lot of time with this would be a lot of fun just to kind of create that. That looks nice. I've got some nice texturing on there. That looks great. So you can kind of see it. We're in front of the graphic, so you can kind of see it nicely. All right, so we've got our bumpies, and now what do we do with it? What we can do now is bake out this normal map from our high poly model. Now, on our low polygon model, this is going to be where our target is. And so I'm going to go Shift A to create a new image texture. So down to Texture, Image Texture. We're going to save this on something called Normals 2. If you do not have one, all you need to do is click on New, and then create a new Normals 2. I'm just going to use Normals 2 from what I've had created prior. Now, from here, we need to do the baking task. And the baking task, what we're going to do is make sure your bake type is set at normal. So now we can't have bake for multi-res because we have no multi-resolution modifier. We're going to unclick that, make sure our bake type is normal. Don't change any of the defaults here. Select it to active, and we'll show you how to make sure that you've selected things in order to make sure that everything is peachy keen jelly bean. So select it to active. I set an extrusion of 1 meter because we want to try and just get all of the detail that we can on the height. You could use 0. It works okay. 0 is kind of unlimited, but it doesn't seem to work quite perfectly. That's okay. If you're not seeing any of these settings, what you may have is you're not set to cycles. So make sure you set your rendering engine to cycles and go back to the baking tab. So there's this baking menu, normal, default, selected to active is clicked, extrusion of 1 meter, and the output is an image texture that we're going to use right here. So making sure that image texture is selected, we're good to go. Now we need to select things, except we have to do it in a very appropriate order. So we want to make sure we go from the selected to the active. So our active model right now is the pot. If I hold Shift and click on high poly, the darker orange is now selected. So now we're going to go from our selected to our active. All we need to do now, make sure that image texture is selected and click bake. And wait patiently for the wonderful baking to occur. So as this is happening, all we're doing is taking the surface of the high poly model and we're trying to put it on our low poly model. So from there, we can now drag this into color, right? Well, no, we can't do that. We need to create a normal map. How do we do that again? Shift A, or using the add menu, I'm just going to search for it, clicking on search, normal. And not normal, you want normal map. So clicking on normal map, voila, and then color to the normal map. Now, it's already set at non-color. This is something you want to make sure you set. You cannot change it unless you save it. So let's make sure I save. So hamburger button, image, save. Now that that's saved, I can change this to non-color. If it was sRGB before, you want to make sure it's non-color. Now from there, normal and normal. and you can see we've got our bumps. So from our high poly model, we have our bumps. Let's now hide the high poly because that's what's selected there. You can see we've got our bumps. And a lot of that texturing is there. It looks pretty good. I can see the bumps on my low poly model. The high poly one's hidden. This is all low poly model, and I have that nice bumpy texture that's showing up there. So that means we've set this up correctly, which is very good. I like it. I like it a lot. Let's change the material color just so we can see if it looks a little bit better. So we're on material 002. So clicking on the material button right here, those are your material properties, is the ball. Material 002 is selected. Again, we should be naming our materials, but not a big deal as we're just learning some of the processes. I'm going to change it to kind of a clay structure here. Let's darken a little bit, and there. You can really see our high poly detail. Now, how do I know that this has worked? So if we hide the lid and we hide our sphere, the honey, this only has 700 triangles. Let's bring the high poly back. Still 90,000. Still quite a few going on here, right? So big difference. You think the computer is going to like your 700 versus 90,000? You bet it is. And we can still make it look just as good. This is highly simplified as well, right? We've created a very, very, very simplified version of what this can be. If you work a lot more with this technique, you can create some very, very powerful things. So this was high poly modeling created from low poly models. I hope you've taken away the two wonderful versions of creating high poly models. What you want to be able to do now is create this honeypot, have all the details, and if you want to go really crazy, add some unique texturing to create some labels if you so choose, utilizing texture paint. Other than that, I really just need a fully completed honeypot. If you are giving this to me, if you're not, your challenge for those that are in the wonderful world of the interwebs, you need to start working with the honey and with the lid, because you can do the same thing. You can create some weathering and some cracks on the lid. Again, my personal recommendation is multi-resolution. It's just a lot easier to work with. It seems to work a lot better. You're not playing with UV maps between two different objects. Really, the UV map that's the most important is the low poly piece. Again, the UV map that I have down here, you can see it because it's part of the bake. It's not great, and that's where I would want to spend more time creating a much cleaner UV map to get a much better bake. And that's just something we're going to work on when we look deeper into the world of texturing. So once again, Mr. David Brown, BCHS Digital Media, intermediate modeling, high poly from low poly. Take care out there.